have actually gotten my hands on Colleen Hoover's list. You know, the one we talked about yesterday, the reasons why she preferred Blake Lively's cut over Justin's. And you know how she said it was 57 things? It's actually 67. 67, anybody? I apologize.
There is a document at the center of one of Hollywood's most complicated behind-the-scenes disputes, and most people still do not know it exists. It is not a legal filing. It is not a leaked text message. It is a 67-point email written by best-selling author Colleen Hoover, sent quietly to a Sony Pictures executive in May of 2024, and it changes the way you have to read everything that came after. If you have been following the turbulent production history of the film adaptation of It Ends With Us, you already know the broad outlines. Director Justin Baldoni and star Blake Lively fell into a very public and very ugly conflict. Lawsuits were filed. Allegations were made. The story dominated entertainment news for months. But what has largely been overlooked in all of that noise is the role Colleen Hoover herself played in the months leading up to the film's release, and what her private communications reveal about where her loyalties actually landed and when. That email is what we are going to work through today, and it deserves serious attention. The details matter here. Rushing past them would do a disservice to what is genuinely a revealing piece of evidence in an already sprawling story. Before we get into the substance of the document, it is worth establishing why this email is significant at all. After all, the author of a book being adapted into a film has every right to have opinions about the finished product. Nobody would dispute that. Colleen Hoover wrote the source material. Of course, she would care how her story was translated to screen. That part is entirely reasonable. What makes this document interesting is not that she had opinions. It is the specific timing of when she expressed them, who she expressed them to, the careful framing she used when she did, and what she openly admitted about her own relationship with Blake Lively at that particular moment. When you hold all of those pieces together at once, the picture that forms is considerably more complicated than a simple author advocating for her creative vision.
Is the email Colleen Hoover sends Josh Greenstein, and it's actually 67 things that she points out to Josh.
If this kind of careful, evidence-based storytelling is what you come here for, take a second and subscribe before we go further. There is more to come on this case, and you will want to be here for it. Now, the email itself. It was sent on May 20th, 2024, by Colleen Hoover to Josh Greenstein, a senior executive at Sony Pictures. The subject line was blunt and businesslike. Thoughts, Blake's version. She was responding to having been given access overnight to a cut of the film that Blake Lively had assembled or significantly influenced, and she had clearly spent a meaningful amount of time with it before writing back. The email opens with a layer of social management that is worth paying close attention to. Hoover signals immediately that she is sending this list only to Josh, not to Blake directly, and she is explicit about her reasoning. She writes that she does not know Blake well enough at all, but that she thinks it is important Blake eventually hears what she loved about the changes Blake made.
This email is sent in May, but Colleen Hoover is talking about the fact that she doesn't know Blake at all.
Because that goodwill might make Blake more willing to trust Hoover's own suggestions in return. She also notes, carefully, that some of what she is flagging may actually reflect changes that were already present in Justin Baldoni's version of the film, not Blake's, and she wants to be precise about distinguishing between the two. Read that opening slowly, and think about what is actually being communicated beneath the surface.
He doesn't know her at all. So how are you guys plotting and planning against this man with everything we saw?
This is an author carefully positioning herself between two competing camps. She is not writing to Blake. She is writing to an executive. She is cataloging what she admires about one cut as a strategic tool, a foundation of goodwill she can then draw on to advance her own creative preferences. She is being transparent about the fact that she does not have a close personal relationship with Blake at this point, and she is already anticipating that this list could function as a piece of leverage in a larger creative negotiation.
Everything Blake Lively said about your relationship, but we're finding out you're telling Josh in May.
That is not the letter of someone who has simply been swept up in another person's orbit. That is the letter of someone navigating a complicated situation with a great deal of deliberateness. What makes the timeline so striking is what came immediately after. By June of 2024, just weeks after this email was sent, the public image looked entirely different. There were accounts of Colleen and Blake spending time together, of warmth and developing friendship, of conversations about collaborating on the sequel. The impression that formed in the public eye was one of an author and a star who had found a genuine connection.
This is big enough for you guys to see, but right up top, you can see this is from Colleen Hoover on May 20th.
But in May, Hoover was telling a Sony executive that she did not know Blake well at all. Whatever that relationship became, it became very fast. And the email exists as a timestamp for where things stood before it did. That gap between the private admission in this document and the public presentation that followed is the part of this story that has not received the attention it warrants. Now let us move through what the 67 points actually say, because they are not all equal in significance, and it would be a mistake to treat them as one undifferentiated mass of opinion. Some are small and technical, the kind of editorial notes any thoughtful author might raise when watching a film adaptation of their work. Others reveal something more substantive about what Hoover believed the film should be, who she thought understood it better, and what her instincts about character and audience actually looked like in practice.
Now, this is like exactly almost like the PGA letter because it's a lot, but Colleen is a writer, so we're gonna let her get away with the word salad at certain points, but we get off.
She opens her specific feedback by focusing on the very first shot of the film. She describes what she sees in Blake's expression in those opening seconds and makes a case for why that image, a woman looking sad, pensive, and carrying something heavy, should be the entry point into the entire story. She frames this not just as an aesthetic preference, but as a matter of serving the readers who came to the film already knowing the book. She writes that she is approaching all of this from the perspective of the millions of readers who experienced the source material first. That framing is worth pausing on, because it implicitly positions her as the reader's representative in a dispute between two competing visions of the film. And it raises an obvious question about Justin Baldoni, the director who actually sought out this book, optioned it, and worked to bring it to the screen in the first place. Baldoni has said publicly that he read the novel, connected with it deeply, and believed in its potential long before it became the cultural phenomenon it eventually grew into. The idea that the author would cast herself as the advocate for reader experience while tilting her feedback away from his version and toward another is a tension the document itself does not resolve. Moving further into the list, many of the notes are genuinely craft-driven and reflect a careful, attentive eye. She writes about a scene involving a chair being kicked, arguing that reducing that action to a single moment rather than letting it repeat multiple times makes the character responsible for it significantly less alienating to the audience. This matters to her because the emotional arc that follows depends on the audience remaining open to that character rather than having already written him off. It is a thoughtful note about cause and effect in screen storytelling, the kind of observation that comes from someone who understands how small choices accumulate into larger impressions. She writes about a napkin with numbers written on it, and whether a viewer who has not read the book will understand its significance, or whether they will simply assume the character is holding a tissue and has been crying. She does not demand that change be made. She just wants the shot held a fraction of a second longer before the napkin is crumpled. Enough time for the detail to register. That restraint, the willingness to name a concern without insisting on her own solution, is one of the more measured qualities in the document. She writes about the pacing of a scene where a character's trauma is revealed verbally for the first time, a moment where someone says out loud that they watched a child die. She argues that the line arrives too quickly after an earlier emotional admission from the other character, and that an extra beat of silence before it lands would give the audience the space to emotionally prepare. The subject matter is heavy enough, she writes, that rushing into it diminishes its impact rather than sharpening it. These are not the notes of someone unfamiliar with the mechanics of storytelling. Hoover is a skilled and prolific author with a well-documented instinct for emotional pacing, and that instinct comes through clearly in how she thinks about the film. That much is not in question. What becomes more revealing are the moments where she acknowledges the limits of her own position. At one point, she flags a scene involving dialogue she originally wrote for the book and admits, openly, that she has always wished she had written that particular exchange differently. She accepts that it has to stay in the film because the story would not function without it, but she is clearly still carrying some discomfort with it. That kind of honesty about her own work is not what you typically find in a document being deployed strategically. It makes the whole email feel more genuine, which in some ways makes it more consequential, not less. She is not performing authority. She is working through her own layered feelings about a story she created and no longer fully controls. There is a moment in the list where she notices a grammatical error in a journal entry written by a teenage character. 2 instances of the word yours appear, where one should carry an apostrophe. She acknowledges that fewer than 1% of viewers will catch it, but that the readers who do will immediately lean over to whoever they came to the theater with and point it out, because readers cannot help themselves when they spot a spelling error. It is one of the more charming observations in an otherwise dense and deliberate document. It is also a reminder that Hoover is writing as a reader first, and that the community of readers she is thinking about throughout this email is the same community that made her one of the most commercially successful novelists of her generation. That community matters to this story because it is the audience both sides of this dispute were ultimately trying to reach, and both sides understood the value of having Colleen Hoover's visible support when they tried to reach them. There is another note in the list that she flags explicitly as feedback she had already sent to Baldoni's team months earlier, feedback that was received and never acted on. She raises it again here, in an email to a Sony executive, noting that she is including it in case anyone agrees with her now that they did not then. The specific note concerns a line exchange between two characters that she feels does not translate well from the page to the screen, where what works as written dialogue becomes clumsy when performed, and where a character's reaction, delivered through facial expression rather than words, would serve the scene better. It is a reasonable creative point. What makes it notable is the channel she uses to raise it. She tried the director first. The director did not make the change. She is now routing the same note through a studio executive, framing it as part of her assessment of a competing cut. That is not simply an author sharing her views. That is an author using a parallel track to advance feedback that was already declined through the official one. Whether that is appropriate or not is a legitimate debate, but it is worth naming clearly what it is. She also raises concerns about a scene involving a young character pulling food from a trash can. Hoover finds it unsettling that the character smells the food before deciding to take it, and she wonders whether the camera could cut away before that moment happens. The instinct to soften an image of desperation is understandable, but it is also a revealing window into how this author thinks about the limits of what she wants shown on screen. There is a consistent thread running through the list where she gravitates toward the implied, softened, the version of a moment that preserves the audience's comfort. That is a legitimate creative sensibility. It is not a neutral one. Taken together, what these points reveal is a vision of the film that prioritizes a certain kind of readerly satisfaction, an experience that confirms what devoted fans of the book already felt rather than challenging or reinterpreting it. There is nothing wrong with that as a goal. It is, in fact, a commercially sensible goal for a film adaptation with a built-in audience of millions. But it is a specific creative philosophy, and Hoover's consistent preference for the cut that she felt embodied it more closely was not an accidental or passive choice. It was a considered one. By the time this email was written, the shooting was finished. The major editorial decisions had already been made, or were in the process of being finalized. Hoover was not offering feedback during development, when her input might have shaped the film from the ground up. She was offering a retrospective assessment of two competing cuts after the fact, doing so through a studio executive rather than through the director, and doing so in a way that, on balance, elevated one version and diminished the other. The care with which she constructed her opening caveat, the acknowledgement that some of what she admired in Blake's cut might actually belong to Justin's, reads in retrospect as exactly the kind of legally careful language someone uses when they are aware that a document may eventually be read by more eyes than originally intended. Whether Hoover anticipated that this email would end up as part of a litigation record is something only she can say. But the precision with which she laid out her position, the disclaimers she inserted at the beginning, the deliberate narrowing of her audience to a single executive, the careful distinction between what she knew for certain and what she only suspected, all of that reflects a level of awareness that goes beyond the kind of casual correspondence you fire off after a long night watching rough cuts. So, what does the full picture look like when you step back from the individual points and take in the document as a whole? At minimum, it looks like this. Colleen Hoover, in May of 2024, had a position in the creative dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. She had formed that position based on watching both versions of the film. She communicated it to a Sony executive in writing, in a 67-point document that she asked to be kept between them. She was clear that she did not yet have a personal relationship with Blake Lively. And within weeks of sending that email, by all public accounts, a close personal friendship between her and Lively had taken root. None of that proves anything beyond what the document itself says. The email does not allege wrongdoing. It does not contain instructions to harm anyone's reputation. It is a piece of creative feedback delivered through an unconventional channel at an unusual moment. But it exists in a larger context, a context that includes public relations campaigns, legal allegations of coordinated reputational damage, and competing narratives about who is responsible for what went wrong during and after production. In that context, the email is not a minor footnote. It is a timestamp that tells you where one of the most important voices in this story was standing and what she was saying privately before the public story fully formed. The question this document leaves open is not whether Colleen Hoover had legitimate creative concerns about the film. She clearly did, and many of them were thoughtful and well-reasoned. The question is whether her decision to channel those concerns through a studio executive rather than through the director, at a moment when the relationship between that director and his lead actress was deteriorating in ways she may or may not have been fully aware of, constitutes meaningful participation in that conflict. And whether the friendship that blossomed so quickly in the weeks that followed was the natural result of two people discovering a shared sensibility, or whether it was at least partially shaped by the groundwork that had already been laid in private. That is not a question designed to reach a verdict. It is a question that the evidence makes it responsible to ask. What we know for certain is that this was never a simple story about a director and an actress who disagreed. It was always a story about a larger network of relationships, loyalties, and competing interests operating simultaneously, often out of public view. The 67-point email is one of the clearer windows into that network that has surfaced so far. It shows us an author who is more engaged, more deliberate, and more strategically aware than the passive bystander narrative would suggest. And it shows us that the weeks between May and June of 2024 were not a quiet interlude before the public conflict erupted. They were the period in which some of the most consequential positioning in this entire story was taking place. That positioning did not happen by accident. It happened because people with significant stakes in the outcome of this film were making calculated choices about who to align with, what to say, and who to say it to. Colleen Hoover was one of those people. The email is the proof. If there is a broader lesson here, it is one that applies well beyond this particular story. When a public dispute becomes as loud and as binary as this one did, there is enormous pressure to place everyone involved into one of two camps and leave them there. The person who had legitimate grievances. The person who went too far. The innocent bystander. The willing participant. Real situations resist those categories, and the people inside them are almost always doing something more complicated than the narrative allows for. That does not mean accountability disappears. It means the full accounting takes longer, requires more patience, and depends on documents exactly like this one coming to light. The film is currently available to stream. If you watched it when it was first released, going back to it now with the specific scenes Hoover describes in mind is worth doing.
You will see what she saw.
You will understand what she was arguing for and what she was arguing against. You will be in a much better position to evaluate whether the changes she loved were the right ones, and whether the version of the story that ultimately reached audiences was the one that most faithfully served the material, or the one that most successfully served the moment. That is the kind of judgment this story still requires. And it is the kind of judgment that only becomes possible when you have seen the evidence clearly enough to form your own view of it. If you have stayed with this from the beginning, leave a comment with what strikes you most about this document. The detail you find most significant. The moment that changed how you were reading the story. Those responses matter, and they shape where this coverage goes next. Subscribe if you have not already, and come back because there is considerably more still to be said about everything surrounding this film, these people, and the decisions that brought all of it into public view.